Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Haberman, and I am making this video to share the results of a study that I conducted in October of 2024 on the correlations between the big five aspects of personality and Holland's codes of career interest. So if you receive the link to the video directly from me, at some point in the summer or fall of 2024, I reached out to you and asked if you would either participate in the study directly or if you'd be willing to distribute the questionnaire to friends, family members, or colleagues. And so I am sharing this video as my way of saying thanks to you for contributing to my research. My research was quite lengthy, and the defense was scheduled for about 45 minutes. And I understand that it is often difficult to find 45 minutes of uninterrupted time. So I broke each section into a separate video within a single playlist on YouTube for your convenience so that you can watch those videos whenever it is convenient for you. This video is the third in a series of 5. So if you missed the first 2 videos, feel free to go back and watch those because they explain the background information and a little bit more about the research. This video will likely be the shortest. It's a pretty simple methodology, but it just is a very large project. And so I will talk about the questionnaire, how I measured each component and how I distributed the questionnaire. And then I'm going to end with a handful of questions that I've already been getting from viewers. And so I just wanted to follow up with those. As far as the research design, I mentioned that it's a pretty lengthy study, and this slideshow shows why. Similar to my previous videos, I am going to go into a little bit more detail than I would have for my defense, only because this video is not for college professors or PhDs. This is for the people that filled out my questionnaire, so I want it to be understandable for everybody. So I first used a quantitative methodology. That means I was looking at numbers rather than stories. And the second thing is it was a correlational study. So I was comparing 2 different sets of numbers. So if you look at the first bullet point, you can see why this study was so big. I was comparing 10 personality traits with 6 career interests, and that meant that I had to individually measure the relationships between each of those. So that's 60 correlations that I had to run just to answer that very first question. And so if you look at all of these correlations and add it up, it's about 150 correlations just to answer the research questions that doesn't even involve the demographic information. And so that's why this study was particularly big. And because my background is in chemistry, I set this up like reaction wells in a chemical reaction where each relationship is a reaction. So up in the top left corner, you can see here that I have realistic careers here, and I'm going to compare them with my assertive personalities, so that assertive piece of extroversion. And I'm just going to compare every person in the study and see how their realistic scores look and how their assertive scores look and see if there's a relationship between them. As far as the instrument itself, so the way that I measure personality is a questionnaire. And this is a really good measure of personality because it is how a person feels about themselves. And so I can't really argue with that. That's how they view themselves. I did have 5 sections to my questionnaire. The first 2 questions are I asked people to give their consent to participate in the study. So, either they wanted to or they didn't. And then I did want people that were at least 18 years old, because I wanted this to be a completely anonymous survey. And with underage people, you need to have parental consent. And I didn't, that's hard to be anonymous without that consent form. Also, the crux of my study was the the job title and their description. And so this was really important for determining career fit. So I added 3 questions related to career fit in order to see if they were fitted to their interests. I needed to know what kind of job they had. And so some job titles are really vague, like a consultant. So for example, if somebody was a consultant and they listed that, but then in the job description, they were talking about how they help people with finances. Well, a financial consultant, that's going to be more in that enterprising or conventional job type. However, if they say they're a consultant and I look in their job description and it says that they consult with farmers on their soils, well, a soils or agronomy consultant would be more of an investigative and realistic type of a career. And so those job descriptions were really important. Some jobs are pretty self-explanatory, like registered nurse or licensed practical nurse. Those are very, very specific jobs that are really recognizable. So that's why some jobs are and some jobs aren't. And then the next 2 parts of my study were my instrument that I used were questionnaires that had already been developed. So the ONET Mini Interest Profiler, 30 questions that was already developed and validated and reliable. And then the Big Five Aspect Scale 40 was 40 questions. And so the reason I used those 2 pieces is because they're shorter versions. The original version of the interest profiler is 60 questions, and the original version of the Big Five Aspects is 100 questions. So it would have added 90 more questions, and I already had almost 100 questions on mine. So I went with the shorter versions. As you can see here, I've got this rest in peace for Christopher. Christopher Gallagher he worked on a team that developed the shorter version of the Big Five Aspect Scale 40. And in the summer of 2023, I reached out, requested a copy of his research. It hadn't been published yet. It was still in the publication process. Had a brief email exchange with him regarding the research and then didn't talk to him. And then I started writing my research, and I reached out again in the spring of 2024 and found out that he had passed away in a tragic accident just a couple of months after I had emailed him. And so I just want to honor his memory because I'm grateful for him to, for having taken the time to work with me on my research in the middle of that. Regarding ethics, this is kind of standard in research. So I went through the Institutional Review Board process and got IRB approval to study this. And it's essentially a group of people that kind of just double check your work, an extra set of eyes to make sure that your study is appropriate and ethical and that type of thing before working with people, before asking people questions. My initial concerns going into the study was that I was going to get participants from outside my study area. And so in order to keep the study completely anonymous, I added questions about where people lived and worked. And so that would give me the information that kept them in the study area, but still kept them anonymous. My study was focused in a rural Midwestern county, so that limits its generalizability to the world. So, for example, it wouldn't maybe necessarily be translate into an urban area, or it might not translate into a mountainous region. It might not translate into a different country. And so those are standard limitations in a study. However, I ended up about 2 weeks into my study, it became very clear that I was going to need additional participants for this study. The reason that this was so important is because I was coming short on people with realistic, investigative, or artistic careers in the study area. And so I reached out to various organizations that might employ those types of jobs. So, one classic example is that, my background, chemistry, background, that is an investigative and realistic career. And so universities employ chemistry professors. And so that would be an example of a realistic and investigative career. So I reached out to those types of organizations. So as far as artistic careers, I reached out to some musical and studio arts organizations and just around the region that could potentially include those types of careers. And I did get enough to fill my study. And you can see that is where I started that incorporation of those people. As far as questions that I've gotten, this is kind of exciting that my research is increasing curiosity in other people. So the first question that I've gotten since I started this research was where to find the interest profiler. I personally use the ONET online profiler, which can be found at mynextmove.org. And I will link that in the description for everybody. The ONET online website itself is a really, really good resource for finding out more about careers, career types, especially if you're like new, like as a high school student getting into a job, or if you're already in a job and you're changing. So like maybe your company is downsizing and you need to find a job, or maybe, your spouse got a job and you have to move. These are really good resources just to help kind of find a job that's going to be a good fit for you as you change those careers. The second question, and I'm also going to include the ONET online website too in the link. I just don't have it written down here. The second question I get is related to the Big Five Aspect Scale. So personally, my favorite version is the Jordan Peterson understandmyself.com version. And I just like the way that it's laid out. He goes into a lot of detail and there's a lot of stories about how people might interact with each other. And so I really like that. There's also a compatibility feature. My husband and I tried that out when our chosen daughter came to live with us. And it showed us really well how our family dynamics changed when she moved in. And then again when she moved out. And that led to me doing some consulting work for individuals related to relationships, but also organizations related to group dynamics as people move in and out of your organization, how that changes your group dynamics. So obviously, if you don't want to pay for that version, there is a free one. I get to it through the University of Minnesota website, but you can go directly to emilywilloughby.com/research/BFAS, and that version tells you kind of a ballpark figure of not only your Big Five aspects, but also just the Big Five. And it's colored and it's printable. It's very nice. Finally, the last question that I got is where people could find a copy of my dissertation. So the easiest way that you can find it is if you go to Google Scholar and then you do a search for my name, so Mary J. Haberman. My profile is set up on there, and if you just click on my name, it'll bring you to a copy of that study. It is over 300 pages, so I tend to joke with my coworkers that, if you're looking to having trouble sleeping, that might be a good way to fall asleep. So, as I've said before, please continue to ask questions, email, comment below, any of that. I will get the next video out to you, but that would be the results of my study. So I've kind of built you up now, and next video is going to be the results.